Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this new Nexum webinar. In a recent speech by the CEO of Prosci about change saturation, a few recent data points highlighted the importance of the state of fatigue felt by organizations today. On the one hand, 73% of the change managers surveyed by Prosci stated that their organization is close or has even passed the saturation point. At the same time, 76% of CEOs surveyed by PwC say that their organization's ability to change and change even faster in an extremely volatile environment, that ability is a necessity to remain competitive. At the center of these two opposing forces are human beings. As far as they are concerned, the most recent studies in neuroscience highlight another paradox. On the one hand, many ancient and often unconscious brain mechanisms push us to resist change in order to maintain the status quo. On the other hand, other mechanisms are at the origin of a natural attraction for exploration and novelty. These two apparent contradictions illustrate the challenge we face when we have to deal with resistance in a change management project. The mission seems impossible. However, a few key elements of understanding of what is going on and structured approach to managing this issue offers avenues to any change manager can implement. This is what you will learn today from 1 p.m. It will be given in English by Morten Kemp Andersen. I know that many of you regularly follow our webinars and knew Morten already. For the others, please let me briefly introduce Morten. Change management is a real passion for him. Morten is an advanced certified Prosci instructor, and he is also an author about change management. He has been a pioneer in this field in Europe, and today he is one of the most experienced change management experts in our countries. Welcome to those who have just joined us and are trying to get on the train. No worries, the webinar has not yet started. Before we start, let me give you some practical details about this webinar's conduct. You can ask your question throughout the session by using the Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom window. We will answer them at the end of the presentation. If you have technical questions, use the chat icon. I will try to help you as much as I can. Likewise, if you want to share some ideas or experience about what Morten will tell you during the presentation, well, feel free to share that with the whole community, and eventually I will take some feedback from you and share it with Morten, and maybe it will generate additional interesting insights. We will ask you to use poll everywhere from time to time to ask you some questions and get your input on some of the topics during the webinar. How does this work? You have the explanation on the screen. The only thing you have to do is just to connect to the website 3xwpolev.com/nexum. You will be asked to enter a room. You just have to key in Nexum, and then you will have to ask to enter a first name, and then you can go into the room. Please pay attention. All your answers remain anonymous, so we will not make any use of those information, and we don't know who you are, and this is what it has to be. While you connect to Paul everywhere, let me briefly repeat what you will learn today. Those who regularly follow our webinars know that the Prosci methodology is a holistic method. It deals with all aspects of change management. Unsurprisingly, a large part of the methodology is devoted to managing resistance. This part of the plan is one of the heaviest. This is why every role involved in managing the change has a contribution to deliver in reducing this obstacle. At the end of this edition, I hope you will leave with a clear view of the symptoms of resistance, and they are not always so obvious to spot, but also on the main levers you have to build your future resistance management plan. With this clear view in mind, we hope you will be able to get more impact on reducing resistance and thus increase the return of your project. I wish you an excellent webinar. Morten, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Renaud, and welcome to this webinar on managing resistance. I really appreciate that you've taken your time to spend an hour with me on talking about what I think is a really, really fascinating topic. I know I say almost every month that we have a webinar that this is a really fascinating topic, but I really do think that managing resistance is a fantastic topic. I think it is a hard thing to deal with well, and I know it's a necessarily thing that we need to deal with it well. So I think it is a really, really interesting. So it is, resistance management is a hot topic. When we go and look on our website, for people that visit our website, but actually also Prosci's website, this is the one which is searched the most. This is something that people are querying about or want to find out more. Now, resistance is an interesting word. I hear a lot of concern from some people about the word resistance. It seems so negative. It has such a negative connotation to it. And I just want to put forward for you a really simple definition of resistance. To me, this just amplifies the importance of using the word. And it's just an act or an instance of opposing or taking a pause before you move on. So it's an act or instance of opposing or a pause as you're moving along. And it's opposing for a lot of reasons. So if we want to get underneath, and we want to get underneath that today and learn about what resistance is, how we can proactively manage it or mitigate resistance, but also what are some of the actions and steps that you can take today or tomorrow or next week on a particular project that you may be leading. Or maybe it's one that is impacting you and maybe you are resisting to a change, or maybe you are having a pause thinking about how will this affect you before you move on. So put on both your change practitioner hat, but also maybe your impacted person hat, and put that on. And let's start considering this topic from both of those perspectives. So I'm going to start first of all by just unpacking a tiny bit of the nature of resistance and the importance of not underestimating the power of comfort with how things are today. If there's some of you who are listening or watching here who have neuroscience or maybe psychology as a background, or maybe behavioral sciences or any sort of social science as a background. Now, if you have that kind of background, you will know that when we unpack the brain, and this was also something that I know said just a second ago, if we unpack the brain science behind change, there are basically both physiological and psychological impacts associated with a natural anxiety and a natural fear that the change introduce. So the key takeaway is just acknowledging, recognizing, and frankly, honestly, welcoming that natural reaction to change. So from a practitioner perspective or change leader perspective, the goal is to mitigate the resistance, but not to eliminate all resistance. Resistance is a very important signal to us. It's a signal that when we start looking at ways to dissect it and analyze it, and we look for patterns and trends and so on, it tells us something very important and very actionable information that we can take to increase the probability of change success. The other thing is that we just really need to think about not being surprised about resistance to change. We should both expect it, we should plan for it. And again, I always welcome that when I helped in change resistance workshop, that I try to draw out very early in the process that it could be managed properly. So that was a learning opportunity to be constructive to our adaptive efforts around change and to improve things if we plan for it and if we do that early. So I'm going to challenge you straight away in this PolyV. As Renaud said, you can interact with us. So if you go to polyv.com/nexum, you can use your smartphone or you can open a browser. And then I want you to think about the following question. What does resistance to change look like? So frustrations, indifference, not engaged in the project, in denial, yes, absolutely. And as these things ticks over the screen, obviously you're giving me valuable input to me, but also you're giving it to each other. So you're sharing here how you see how a resistance look like. So asking questions again and again and again. Silence, that's true. Sometimes you just don't hear anything. Sometimes people are just not engaged, they're not saying anything. Frustration or avoiding the change. So sometimes workarounds, people are incredibly good at doing workarounds. Lots of questions, not adopting, conflicting priorities. So that can sometimes happen. So I have some KPIs or things that I've been measured on, which goes in this direction, but this change actually leads me in a different direction, and that can create some conflicts, frustration, demotivation, confusion. Yes. So these are all things that people do, or people behave, or people say, that resistance can look like. And obviously it has huge impacts on our projects. Thanks a lot for that. I really appreciate your input here. I'm going to call out a couple of other times for you to give input, and I really appreciate when you do that. So ask to go back to prior step, asking questions. I hear questions quite a lot, and that's absolutely true. People will ask, and sometimes the same questions again and again and again, and we'll get back to what might the underlying reason for that be. So thanks for that. So I want to give you a little bit of context for how we're going to share our information in different ways. Now, one of which is to grab that body of research that sits behind everything that we do. So Prosci is a research organization. They've been studying and compiling a large body of knowledge on change management for over 22 years now. And I wanted to look down at these topics that they have studied. And resistant management is one of those that Prosci have been studied for the longest. And actually we have longitudinal data from over 20 years of how does resistance look like, and what it is, and how do we manage it, and what are some of our best practices. And Prosci has even spun up a couple of years ago a topical study on managing resistance to change. And both of these reports, so both the best practice but also the topical studies, are available to look at in Prosci store. But at the end of the day, I think the most important thing is to make sure that we call out and we examine it and we learn and we take constructive action around it. So resistance can be what I would call constructive input instead of a destructive impact on the organization. Right. So this is our next poly-V, and I want you to go into your smartphone again or on your browser, and this is kind of different. This is a drop a pin poll. And here you can look at these 8 different sections, and based on what you have seen in your organization, how would you describe the resistance? So if you had to describe to me what resistance looked like, and then we've put it into different categories here. Which categories describe the most? And I'm very sure that many of you would have experienced several of them. So disengaged, just being quiet, indifferent, emotional. This is where people might be very angry or frustrated, but they may also have, slightly less active emotions such as depression, negativity. Acting out can be sabotage or being passive aggressive or even celebrate failure. Negativity. Yeah, so I see many of these that you calling out many of these: disengaged, negativity, avoidance, controlling. Interesting. And maybe it's the disengaged and the negativity and avoidance that you see the most, but I can see some on all of them actually. Building barriers, that's when there is a classic breakdown in trust, and people will actually go a long way to excuse themselves or to actually do maybe even the opposite of what it is that is asked. Okay, thanks a lot for that input. And I see all of these are something that you recognize, and maybe some of the first ones are the ones that you see the most. What I like about having these is something that we have a phrase that we call name it to tame it. So if we can name the type of resistance that we're encountering, it's much easier to tame that resistance, right? When we have a low morale. So let's try to get underneath of that, because if people are disengaged, there might be some things that might impact in the organization. I want to share back with you the actual output from this poll that Prosci have been doing. They've been doing this a number of times, and we have had more than 1,000 participants from different countries now participating in this. And this is a summary of that sort of study. And honestly, the order or the sequence that I displayed them on the screen is actually aligned with the quantity, right? So 81% of the participants gave it some formulation that it was something around being disengaged, negative avoidance, and then you have emotional coming afterwards. So the pin drop that you showed actually pretty much reflected on what it is that we see when we ask a lot of people. Now, this is interesting, but how actionable is this? So I wanted to give you some more guidance for how to unpack managing resistance in a contextual model. So before we talk about how to actually take actions. Now, one of the things that we're going to discuss is root causes. Now, what is the root cause for resistance? How am I going to put it into the context of the ADKAR model, which is an amazingly important and valuable tool for identifying root causes. Those of you who know me well will know that I love the ADKAR model. And I think especially when it comes to resistance management, I think it is vital in order for us to identify some root causes. And we can use the ADKAR model for that. So, but before we get to that, I want you to consider two different contexts for resistance, one of which is the personal context. Now, I might have a difficult situation at home or in my family situation that unfortunately comes to work with me. And it just gives me, maybe my bar for receiving change goes up in terms of how much I can consume differences or distinctions. And, you know, I have family pressures at home or whatever. Maybe it's my career history or the plans that I have inside of the organization. Maybe I see this change as something standing in the way of where I want to see myself in the future in the organization. And all of the opportunities that I had hoped that there would be for me, maybe I see this as something standing and blocking that. Maybe there are also things about the degree of change that is impacting me personally. Maybe this is a really big change going on in my organization, and it's impacting my job a lot. And I look around and, oh my gosh, I'm so heavily impacted by this. And it starts giving more of barriers to resistance. So in addition to personal, there are also organizational context considerations. Now, let me ask you this question. And this sort of reflective question. How good is your organization with change? Right? So if I polled your individuals in your organizations and I said, how good are we at managing change or introducing changes in our organization? What would people say? If you find that you have, you know, a mixed bag or even a lot of negative responses to that, well, then that history will come along. So if we have been not so good at introducing changes in the past, well, this new change then that you're asking me to embrace and go on, well, I'm going to look at it and say, well, we're not so good at that. So therefore, I'm not so crazy about this. So, you know, looking at the history also means something. So being open and honest about your history and also your organizational values and cultures matters a lot. What about saturation and capacity? As Renaud said in the beginning, when we ask change practitioners right now, they say that they are above the saturation point of changes right now. Now, this is a really interesting now because this is something that there will be more changes. So on one hand, we have change saturation, and on the other hand, we have more changes going on. So I also want you to think about how many changes do we have underway at the moment, and how will that impact how people will be open to and engaged with this new change. So the question is not if we encounter resistance to change, but rather how do we support our employees through the change process and manage that resistance. So that's something to consider as we pull that forward just a little bit. I also want to bring forward this slide. This is something that we call the unified value proposition or change management on a page. And it is that distinction between the technical side of the change and the people side of the change. The technical side is not necessarily technological. Certainly technology can be a part of the technical side, but it is the design, develop, and deliver of what it is that is changing. It is a new process, it's a new system, it's a new job roles, it's a new location, it's a new compensation model, new job functions, or whatever it is that we're trying to change. But when we introduce a project or a change initiative, there is also the people side to engage, to adopt, and to use the change. And some of you, when I polled you just before, said that change resistance looks like a lack of our adoption. So I just want to point to you a couple of other considerations using this unified value proposition. And that is that the integration of the technical side, often represented by the project management discipline, and the people side executed by the change management discipline, both of these need to work together well in order for us to minimize the resistance that there might be, but also so people understand fully well why we're doing it. So conversations that you might hear are aligned with the technical side and the people side. So here's some potential conversations. So the change as it is designed, it will not deliver what it is that we're expecting. That might not be the exact words that you might hear. The exact words might be, this will never work, or, we've tried this before, or that tool or that system is not the right one, or that new process is not going to be right for us, or whatever it is that you might hear. So there's a lot of things that could happen on the technical side, because we can have a miss there, right? It's nothing to do with the adoption, but if we miss on the technical side, you can bet that resistance will increase. I mean, if the solution is not right for the problem, if the solution is not going to help us, then there will be resistance. So I invite you to go back and look at and just make sure that you're solving for the right problem, right? That you have clarity around the reasons for the change, and that you're designing, developing, and delivering the right solution for that. And I know as change practitioner, that's really not our part of the table. That's not really what we do, so to speak. But you need to go back and see, is the technical side fine? Here are some of the examples of the people side that I want you to think about in terms of the change. So what might be the conversation if I've been really successful in the current state before? How exciting and embracing will I then be? Or, can I have a change that will challenge my current success? I spend a lot of time here. I know how things are done today. In the transition, things might get worse before they get better. I don't have the time to learn anything new. You're asking me to get trained, but I just don't have time for that. Or, a lot of different things may happen before we are at the end of this. So we may shift direction again before we even done with this one. And in the future one, I don't know how things will look when we're done. I'm not sure if I'll be successful after the change, or it's actually quite scary. That's probably not what people will say. But if you use active listenings for those conversations, then you can hear what is it actually that people are saying. And these are some of the things that we can look for in the current transition and in the future state. Now, all of this is important. If I go back to the research, one of the questions that Prosci have asked in the research is to identify the potential risks to your project or to the change initiative related to change, related to resistance that hasn't been managed well or hasn't been mitigated. So if you look at all of these here, are there one or two or maybe more that you are concerned about? So if you're looking at the why, what is the compelling reason? Why are we taking the time to apply the energy and the resources to manage and to mitigate resistance? Well, these are your reasons. So invite, if you're trying to pull a resource plan around resistance management, to come back and pull into what are the reasons for the change? What reasons or reasons do we have that we're changing, and what are the potential risks if we don't do this well? And then you can start to unpack that and address and mitigate resistance. But these are some of the potential, these are the highest mentioned list of the potential risk to the project related to resistance management. These may also be some of the arguments that you can put forward when you are selling your resistance management plan, which is these are some of the things that we can experience if we don't do resistance management well. So I just want to ask you to grab that smartphone again, or to go into that browser and answer the following question. What additional challenges have you encountered managing resistance in a fully virtual or hybrid work environment? Because things have changed. COVID has changed something permanently. We are more dispersed. We are working more from home. And there are some times when there are some employees that will never come to the office again. Now, what will that mean for resistance management? What additional challenges will that be? So lack of body language hints. So when we're in the same room, I can sort of read you in a different way, but through a screen, that's actually really difficult. No real connection. Yes, real connection comes with meeting people, supporting people impacted by the change and handling it. So how to do it. Getting to the root cause, that's actually a really, really good point. So people will say things, but what's really behind it? And that may be harder to get in a virtual language, a virtual environment. And you say body language, absolutely right. Difficult to reach out to people. So when we're sitting in the same office, it might be easier to just pass the desk and say, hey, how are you doing? When it's virtual, then it's much more difficult. Difficult to get that connection, lack of human support. People can hide easier, absolutely. Delayed for virtual meetings, people are not putting their video on, or there's poor data connection still somewhere. Education in teams can be ignored, yes. Less informal contacts, that's a really good point. So again, just stopping by or meeting people in the canteen or the water cooler is more difficult. People having cameras off, yes. And that actually can be a signal, but you don't know quite if that's a signal because that person is resistant to change, or if there's something else. Listens to emotions which are expressed outside of the moment, yes. So as you are typing this through, what you can see is that the new work environment actually creates more difficulty. Absolutely. Thanks a lot for this. I rarely hear from people that it's making it easier. It's easier probably to get people in classroom not in classroom training, but in virtual training. It's probably also easier just to get a 10-minute conversation with somebody if that person is open. But if there is resistance, it's actually much, much harder. So thanks for your input here. So let's take this on. And the rest of this webinar, we're going to spend most of our time talking about resistance prevention. It's so much easier to plan for, address, and eliminate resistance by effectively applying change management before it occurs, so that we don't suffer those negative consequences of having to go back later after a go live, for example, and look around and see that we have got into a lot of resistance response mode when resistance become enduring. So one of the data points from Prosci's 11th edition research was that 83% of the respondents, and that was more than 1,800 respondents, 83% said yes, they did make plans to address change management, resistance management, and it mattered. Well, I don't know about you, but I think that's a really, really exciting statistics, right? To notice that most people are doing what they believe to be the best possible steps and actions to do resistance prevention. And the outcome from it, that was actually something that mattered. The number of people who said that they met or exceeded expectations from the change was much higher for those individuals who took it as an intentional approach. So that's also something we can learn, that if you do something about this, you are proactive, you take resistance prevention avenue and you take that seriously, then you are more likely to meet or exceed project objectives. So the good news is that it seems that we are thinking more about this. Now, what I want to do, however, is to activate you with some more intentional thinking and mechanisms through a case study. So you're going to have a chance to apply what you are learning and observing, so you can have more an intentional way to bring this back. And we're going to focus on the application of the structured process and tools for leading the people side of change to a desired outcome. And what do we call that? We call this change management. So that's where we position change management. And again, the data supports this. We need to apply change management at the beginning of a project or a change initiative, and we need to do it effectively. So we're going to define all of this. We're going to talk about how engaging individuals and all of this. So the intent is to avoid resistance and to make sure that we're sitting in front of that. And that's done through how we unpack this methodology or framework for managing the people side of change. What you see here on the screen is a graphic that depicts the present methodology from Prosci. If you're not familiar with the methodology, if you want to get more information or a refresh, then actually Prosci held a webinar in July where they went through the design of this methodology. So if you have never seen this before or don't know the methodology of Prosci, I would encourage you to go back and listen to that. Now, sitting in the middle of this is the ADKAR model. The ADKAR model, that individual change model that I'm sure many of you are trained in or speak the ADKAR language, right? We add ADKAR to our common vocabulary, awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, and reinforcement. So just as change is individual, think about this, that resistance is also individual. I'm just going to repeat that. So think about, as change is individual, think also that resistance is individual. There may be group patterns of resistance, so we can look at group profiles to determine, but for the most part, we have to get down to and figure out how will an individual respond to the change. So how do we do that if we have an organization of 15,000 or more? What do we do if we have 500 people, 200 people? So we have the supporting mechanisms, and that's where the three-phase methodology comes into play. It's the in phase number one, we start to look at who is it that has to do the job differently and how. As we have the impact and we look at the approach, we talk about what will it do to achieve success. And we call out resources, we call out risk, but we also call out resistance. And then we have the 5 R's that we look at in the design approach. If you want to know more about what the 5 R's are, we go on to the Prosci webpage, or you can go into our webpage again and look that up, or listen to the webinar that I just talked about earlier. If we come to the plan and act stage, that's where we plan for resistance, we prepare, we equip people, and this part of this is the proactive resistance management. And then as our project are unpacking and we're getting results, we continue to track performance and adapt our actions. And that's really critical to success. So all of this is in response to anticipating and responding accordingly to resistance management. So I want to unpack this by person or group, by level in the organization. And finally, I want to introduce some concepts around organizational attributes. So I want you to grab a piece of paper, blank piece of paper if you have that, because we'll be unpacking this together. And the blank piece of paper is always handy as you're starting to jot something down and you move from learning something to going from knowledge and into ability. So I said I would use a case study, and this is what we're going to do. We're going to learn a little bit about this company called Finesta Financial. Those of you who are certified in the 3-day certification, you will know this already, this company already. It's a financial services organization. They were founded in the year 2000, so they are almost 22 years old. They have offices in Chicago, US, which is their headquarter location, but they also have offices in London, Hong Kong, and Sydney. Now, Finesta is, of course, a fictional company, but frankly, a lot of the cases that we're going through with Finesta is actually very realistic. So what about the change? So here's what's going on. Finesta is going through some office consolidations. You know, everything that has happened in the last couple of years with COVID and everything has caused them to go in and look at opportunities to consolidate from 3 different physical locations in Chicago to 1 single location now. They're calling the project a Global Real Estate Optimization Project, or GREO for short, very typical. And for our Chicago office, the office move involves a transition to a permanent hybrid work environment. So they're going to have a hybrid work environment, and they're going to make a declarations of it, what work activities will need to take place in the office and what can remain remote, etc. So you are going to, in this case, you are the team lead. You are leading a team of 10 client service representatives. You are on a single pod. There are 4 pods, so you are 4. There are 4 people leaders, just like you, and each have between 8 and 10 client service associates. Now, some of your team will remain remote. Some of them will return to the office between 50 to 100% of the time. So the new way of working is different between your team members. So you have 10 team members, and they will be impacted differently. Right, so that's the change. So the first question that I want to ask you is, and again, polyv.com/Nexum, what resistance would you anticipate related to the GREO project for your team? So again, imagine you're the team lead, you have 10 people, you are moving into this permanent hybrid workplace. Some of your team members will continue to work remote, some will be in the office 50 to 100% of the time. What resistance challenges do you think there will be related to this project? Sense of inequality, absolutely. So some will have to come into the office, some can stay at home. Lack of one team feeling, yes. So many of you are pointing at this, it's not fair, why him, not me or her, it's not fair, I think it's unfair. Many of you are pointing out, yes. So one of the things that you could anticipate is that there'll be some jealousy, or people will say this is not fair, or it might even break up the idea of having one cohesion team, or one team. The why is it not everybody? Why is it them and not me? Why can I not come to the office? So it can create conflict between the team members. Good ideas. Any other things maybe for, so we are moving from 3 offices into 1 office. That means that there'll be some people that will need to drive to work in a different way than maybe they did before. So let's say that everybody was in the office at some levels before. Those people going to the office now probably need to drive further, or maybe it's more difficult to get parking spaces or something like that. So, so there is definitely some kind of, and one of you is mentioning the SCARF reaction, the status, the certainty, the autonomy. That's a great framework. I like that a lot. So there's also the sense of isolation. So some people will continue to remote, and they may even want to be in the office 100% of the time. Time to travel, yes, absolutely. So I think, and there might even be some people that will have shorter time to work. So the 3 offices going into 1 might be that it's close. Maybe the new office is close to some really nice sandwich places. So getting lunch is now a treat. Maybe there are no places to eat there, and therefore actually getting lunch is more difficult. So many things will happen. Obviously, some team members will be treated differently. People might also be thinking about compensation. Thanks a lot for all of that input. So as you can see, there are things that you can anticipate in advance as you're doing this. So now we get to ADKAR, and a way that we can use the ADKAR is to identify what types of resistance are we likely going to see. So we can map or we can survey for ADKAR. So you can sort of ask people, do you fully understand the reasons for this change, or have you chosen to support and participate in this change? Or knowledge is, I have the knowledge I need to know in order to change. Ability, I have the ability to implement this change, and reinforcement, I will continue to do this. So I invite you to consider, as the pod leader, as a team leader for these 10 people, that you can run an ADKAR assessment on each of these 10 people individually. And hopefully you are a change practitioner and or the leader for this overall initiative. You've also been tracking group ADKAR scores all along, because there are things that you can be doing in the way that you can engage the sponsors and the senior leaders around awareness, for instance, to start to articulate the why and why now and what happens if we don't, and all of these things. So awareness at the group level of concern, but then you can also do an ADKAR at the individual level. And then, and I know this is sort of made up, but many of the things that you mentioned were around desire. I think it's unfair, and unfair is an emotion that sits with desire, but also a couple of you highlighted why. So why are we moving out of these 3 offices and into 1? And why are we doing it now? And what happens if we don't? These are all awareness questions. So as you can see, you can go in and say, maybe Paul is low on awareness, but Pia, she's actually low on desire. And Peter, he is low on the ability, because he will not be able to transport himself to the new office because he has no car and it's too far to cycle, and the public transport is actually really hard there. So you might want to look at the different ADKAR elements and trying to figure out what is it that stands in the way. So how might we use ADKAR to help manage resistance? Well, I want you to think on that, because on the screen here, you can see a resistance management plan by person or by group or by impacted group. The impacted group could be a functional role, or it could be a location. So it could be everybody in this particular office, or it could be everybody in HR, or it could be something. There's actually many different ways you can think about impacted group. So what you can do is you can take a person or an impacted group, and then you can think which ADKAR element is their barrier point. And then you can write that down for, let's say that it is an awareness. I simply don't understand why we have to do this right now. Well, then you can, on this resistance management plan, what you can do is you can write down what is some of the behavior, what is some of the root cause, what approach should we do this? Well, we might have a sponsor doing another town hall meeting because it wasn't clearly understood the first time, or the nearest manager have to reinforce that message from the last town hall meeting or something like that. Who is it that should be doing it? When will it happen? And what do we hope to get out of it? So what you can do is you can take a person. So if it's the 10 people that are reporting to you in this Finesta case, then you can take each of them and write down where is their barrier point. And you can use this ADKAR on a page to, it's sort of a visual that we use, and you will have this in the handout that Renaud will give you. And I think this ADKAR model on a page visual is good because it's a great aid, because it also includes the triggers for building some of the barriers. I'm just going to highlight this to you. So as you're creating a resistance management plan, what you can do is you can actually try to figure out what is the barrier point. And then I also want you to be thinking about the root causes. And every time that when you do a resistance management plan, I invite you to go back and consider those sort of personal or organizational contextual elements that we talked about earlier associated, and think about what might the root cause be. Because when it comes to resistance or conflict management, there can often be a big difference between what it is people are saying and what it is people are really talking about. So it might be that they're talking about, it takes longer time to drive to work. But what they're really talking about is that they think it's unfair that I have to go to the office. So it might be that there is a difference between what it is people are saying and what it is that people really mean. So I invite you to, when you do resistance management plans, to go back and really think hard about the root causes, because there's nothing worse than fixing symptoms and then you think it's all done and you find out that it hasn't mattered in terms of removing the barriers for the resistance management, because it really wasn't the symptoms that was the issue, it was a root cause. Right, so what you're doing here is an ADCA-based role plan, and I want you to put your people leader hat back on. You might have heard the CLARK acronym before. It's the Prosci's 5 people manager roles that are aligned with the 5 roles that you see on the left-hand side here. And as we look at how ADCA measures up or aligns with a barrier point, we can throw all kinds of things into our resistance management plan, but they need to be intentional. And that's probably my most important feedback to you, is that resistance management needs to be intentional. We need to do something active and it needs to be intentional. So we need to have an advocate and a communicator pass on the why now, what if we don't do it. I need to demonstrate commitment for this. One of my colleagues were working for a client engagement and they were going through an office change, and the floor that they were the person was delivering the training program on was on a floor that was being remodeled, and sitting over in the corner were 2 people in this huge new space associated with the remodeling. And my colleague asked the host, who are those people? And she said that were the 2 senior leaders of the organization that was going to move into this space. And that's an example of demonstrating commitment. So when they were touring and doing the engagement activities, there were actually already 2 senior leaders sitting there working in this space. You also see resistance management is identifying these root causes and celebrate and sustain. We see supporting in terms of know how to and support the execution, and sort of when we have results and also give that feedback to the project team. Make sure that you reinforce celebration and sustainment of the change. So isn't that fascinating that the ADCA intersects with the resistance management plan? And it sort of starts to unpack this and much simpler frame. Just because I can do a lot of things, let's target our actions on the things that matter. When they matter by the person, and it should be done by the person that it matters from. And doing that will be the primary resistance manager for the team. Let's look at some research regarding resistance. What is the top reasons for employee resistance? Look at number 1, lack of awareness of the reasons for change. Now, I don't know about you, but I can solve for that one. Those personal situations, organizational context are a little bit more complicated, in many cases a lot more complicated, but it is certainly something that I can solve for lack of awareness. So of the reasons for the change. The respondents to the survey said that had they done this intentionally, 47% said that had they done this intentionally, they could have had more than 50% of the resistance actually would have been avoided altogether. What about the managers? So before I put you in the shoes of people managers for in the Finesta case, what about your resistance or the people manager resistance? And don't underestimate the resistance that you or we have, all of us going through a change, no matter what our role is. We are employees first and managers or senior leaders second. So organizational culture is the number 1 reason for managers' resistance. So how can I engage organizationally? But look at number 2. Again, it's lack of awareness and knowledge. So survey respondents, 51% of them said that they could have avoided at least half of the experienced resistance if they had dealt with this in advance. So let's take our final poll. So if you think of you as a people manager, and I want you to think again in the Finesta case, you are the client service people manager. What resistance do you think you could have to this change? And again, I know we're role playing here, but think a little bit about as a manager to this office relocation. What resistance might you have to this change? So if you go into polyv.com, so turnover, so you might actually be concerned about turnover. Team meetings are more difficult to do. Yes. So before maybe we could meet all of us physically. Difficult to follow up on performance. So it was easier before to see how people were working, but now I feel it's all difficult. It's also my own situation. Do I want to drive into the work at this new office building? It's harder to be one team, lose control of team, absolutely. My goals are not in line with the company. So it's actually interesting because it's really important for people managers to be on board because they're the ones doing the resistance management. There was a lot of resistance that you identified from the direct reports or from the 10 people. But we can also see that there are some resistance that will come from the people manager. And that's obviously very, very hard. So it will require more of me as a manager. The change will have impact on the volume of work. Yes. So all of these are very, very valid and very important reasons for why I might resist as a manager. So let's think about this for a moment. And I want to introduce another conceptual frame for you, which is about the manager's challenge. Now, you need to effectively lead your team through a change leveraging those Clark roles, while you are most likely engaged in the particular change yourself as well. So you have to go through yourself, your desire point before you can be able to advocate authentically for this change with others. Now, what does that mean? It means that you also have to have commitment and the why and why now and what if we don't. And you have to chosen to participate. So how many of those resistant challenges that you're experiencing are in fact something that you're also experiencing yourself as a people leader? So it's something that we have to think about intentionally. How can we get the people leaders on board as well? So as a project lead, I need to make sure that all of my people leaders have this accurate journey progression before they are team members. So give it time and give it attention that it takes, because otherwise you're missing a lot. And these people will not engage with you in terms of managing the change. So your challenge and how you might embrace this or employ this is that I want you to go back and look at this, for instance. And this is pretty much how the worksheet looked before. But now we are looking at it not by impacted individuals or by impacted group, but by levels in the organization. Are you seeing, or are you observing employee resistance or middle managers, or even at executives or senior managers? Because who do you think is the most resistant group? From our research, or from Prosci's research, we know that it is actually the middle managers that is the most resistant group, because there are things happening below them that push things up, and there are things happening above them that are pushing things down, and they're sort of in the middle of this and losing power, losing control, overloading with responsibilities and so on. So it's very much the same question, but I just want you to think about what is the root causes when executives have resistance, and what might you be able to do about it? And sometimes you might say, well, it's my sponsor. It's not really my responsibility, or it's not up to me to manage the resistance of that particular person. And that might be true, but the question is the fact is that the more on board that the middle level managers and the supervisors and the executives and the senior managers are, the more they are on board, the more likely it is that they will take on their role in terms of managing the resistance in the organization. And therefore, the more likely it is that the change will be a success. So you also need to think a little bit about how do I onboard the middle level managers? How do I onboard the executives? Who needs to do that? What activities would be appropriate? And then try to push that forward. A question I sometimes get is, do every change or project initiative need a resistance management plan? It's my belief that as a change practitioner, you must always bring up resistance, because no matter how simple or how unimpacted or how welcome the change is, don't underestimate the control with the comfort with the status quo, so or the current state. So we need to create some kind of resistance management plan. So, but how big should my resistance management plan be? Well, I want to introduce for you that there are different ways to scale your resistance management efforts, because not all changes are created equal. I have on the screen a model from our 3-day certification program. This is the risk grid, where we introduce the concept of change characteristics and the organizational attributes as a survey of identifying the people risk from for a change from low being change ready, it's a small incremental change, to high being change resistant and a large disruptive change. Now, if it's a simple change, say an update to an internal intranet site, and let's say it's from a user perspective, it's a simple change and it's a welcome change, well, there we might only need to do a 1 or a 2-page resistance management plan. And it mostly has to do with, change management for awareness at the core level and maybe some knowledge about the differences and distinctions. But compare that to a high-risk change, where a resistance management plan that might be looking at multiple pages and multiple efforts woven together with your overall project model. So I think there's some things that I will invite you to consider regarding the scaling of your efforts. Not all changes are equal. Not all resistance management plans need to be the same. So again, it's just an insight, it's just an awareness that you build through doing this work and building on that intuition and your need. And if you actually do the organizational attributes assessment, you'll have a much better feel for, does this need to be a back of an envelope plan, or does this need to be, a proper scale plan where we have multiple pages, include multiple stakeholders in order to make this through? So that's how you can use this. So some of the things that I wanted to unpack for you today was, first of all, impacted by groups, looking at individuals or impacted groups, looking at the ADCAP area, what might be the anticipated resistance, what is some of the root causes behind that, and then create a resistance management plan to target that. You can also look at it by organizational level, where you can think about the different levels and what might be the root causes, or why do they resist the change, and what might be the root causes, and then what should your approach to the managing resistance be? And finally, how you scale your plan. I do think that every plan should have some kind of thought around resistance and resistance management, but using the risk assessment in order to try to figure out how big of a plan you might want to have. Now, all of this has been in the concept of the proactive, the resistance prevention on the right, on the left-hand side. This has been to prevent resistance from ever arising. Now, what I invite you to do is also consider your project to change the nature of what does resistance response look like. And we won't have time to unpack this in this webinar. As you can see, we only have a couple of minutes left, but there are also things that you can do post go live or post implementation. So how might you address that resistance response? And here, Prosci is really coming with a set of tactics that can be used when resistance become enduring or persistent. And these tactics are very much the people manager, the nearest supervisor's role to use these tactics towards the employees. And how do we react when resistance beginning to occur? And again, remember that it's a natural reaction to change. So there will be some resistance that you could not have prevented altogether. To me, this is something like a playbook of things that you might be able to do, how we react, how we understand, how do we deal with resistance. That resistance is natural. How do we deal with it in our organization? These 10 tactics that Prosci has done, and you can find them on our website, are a really good starting point. And I just highlighting it now so you can identify that as a next step. And there will be a webinar where we will unpack them at a later point. So with that, that was all I had time for today, talking about resistance prevention on a project. We have a couple of minutes left. Are there any questions?
Yes, some questions did show up during your presentation, and most of them were also answered during your presentation. But there is one question where we can go a little bit deeper on is the following question. It's related to the technical part of the project. When you know that the technical part of the project will not deliver the expected outcome, how you can expect, of course, that the people will resist a little bit more because they know that the solution is not delivering the expected outcome. How do you, as a change manager, how do you handle that kind of resistance in such a situation?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I mean, unfortunately, that happens quite often, right? So you can see this is a solution that's being built. Everybody knows, or many people in the organization know, this is not going to solve the problem. And we have engaged with the vendor. It will be too expensive to get out of it, or we're halfway through, so we will continue. What do we do then? And there are several things. The first thing is people in the technical side and in the sponsor group needs to know. They need to know that this is not the right solution, that there are certain things that we can do today that we cannot do in the future, or that this is the problem we're trying to solve, but this will actually not solve the problem. So you need to feed that back. And sometimes you can be the liaison between the people side and the technical side. And I will, so the first thing is to feed that back. And not in terms of this is a crappy solution, why are you always coming up with bad solutions in IT or something like that, but instead trying to come up with, some good reasons for why might this not be. That's the first thing. The second thing is, then the organization has decided we are going to continue with this. We understand the concerns. We understand this will not solve the problem, but we are going to continue. Then you will need to do an elaborate resistance management plan. It might not be that people exactly agree with what we're doing here, but they need to know why. Why have we picked this solution? Why are we doing this? Why do we continue, even though we know this is not the right solution? And sometimes the reason is just that it will be too expensive not to, or we have started, or whatever it is. But a sponsor needs to step up and say, why are we continuing? Why are we doing this? And then you need to engage with the project team in terms of finding out, how do we train people well? Are there any workarounds that we can do to solve this issue? But it will require an elaborate resistance management plan. My expectation is that this is mainly around awareness and desire. It's not so much about knowledge and ability, because people actually resist going into learning about this because they just know this is not the right thing. So this is an awareness and desire thing, and you will need to have a lot of support from the sponsor, but also from your people managers. Get the people managers on board so they don't talk bad about the solution as well. Okay.
Thank you, Morten. And there is, I think, one question that could be very relevant for the audience as well is to manage resistance. Although you are trained with the most Prosci methodology, are there special skills that you need to have or to develop yourself to be a good resistance manager? Because most of the resistance management has to be with direct contact with people. What kind of skills could be the most useful?
Yes. So if we're talking about the skills from a people manager point of view, because I think that's really the crux of it, is that it's people managers that needs to be doing the resistant management. So we can prepare, we can plan, we can equip, we can support, we can enable, but it's the people managers that will ultimately sit in front of an employee and help that person through. It's definitely some kind of knowledge about resistant management or conflict management will be useful, but I think some kind of emotional intelligence level will be of value, that you have some kind of people skills so you can sit in front of a person and not explain and not defend and not talk about the technical fantastic things about this technical solution, but that you can sit in front of a person face to face and really have an emotional dialogue about what is this going on, because a lot of the time this is a low desire, it's an emotional thing, and you cannot explain that away with technical reasons or performance reasons or anything like that. You need to connect with that person at an emotional level. So I'll probably say knowing about resistant management, knowing about conflict management is great, but also having some kind of emotional intelligence is probably important too.
Okay. Thank you, Morten. There are no major questions, small ones, but most of them have been answered, and we get lots of message of thank you for this presentation. So thank you, Morten, for this presentation. Thank you for all of you guys to be with us today. We appreciate that, to see you with so many in the room, and each time a little some more or some new face do pop up. So that's very great to see that. If you still have questions or if some questions do pop up in the coming days, feel free to get them back to me, and I will spread them to Morten or to anyone else in the organization being able to help you. Please know that the webinar's recording and the slides will be made available on our website early next week. And feel free to share those, because they are freely available with possibly interested colleagues. And for those who are willing to go deeper into the topic, please do visit our blog. There is a lot of additional information to be found there, and we have also some readings and some additional webinars. And I would like to take the opportunity to ask you not to forget to fill in the short satisfaction form that you will get tomorrow, because tomorrow is Saturday, but it will be sent out tomorrow. But early next week, when you are back in the office, if you can just take 2 minutes of your time just to let us know what you think and feel about our webinars, we really appreciate your feedback. And if you want just to be kept up to date about our training, publication, whatever, you can just subscribe to our newsletter on our website, and you will remain informed. Please note that the dates of our next webinar are not yet published, but they will be published soon. We are closing quite a long series, and we are working on preparing the next session. But you can expect one promise from us, is that there will be one next webinar before the end of the year. This is a promise, and you have heard it. It only remains me just to wish you an excellent end of the day and a wonderful weekend, and to see you all soon in good shape. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.